You are in Why Classical and Lutheran Education for a Special Needs Child. They seem like they don't match at all, and we're going to attempt to show how, in fact, they do. What we're going to do, first I'll give you an overview. Just like you do with any special needs child, we benefit from it too, just the structure. We have a whiteboard at home, and every single day we have the schedule on it. Weekends, summers, my kids come down. I have 16-year-olds with severe special needs, and they both check the board every day to see what's going on, and it just gives them, okay, I know what my structure is. So first we're going to go through some definitions and distinctions, like classical era studies versus classical education. Who is a special needs child? The government special ed approach versus what I call adapted classical Lutheran education, that approach. We'll talk about those. Then I want to give you a very brief history of classical education and special education, a combination there. We're going to talk about the quantifiable reasons for classical Lutheran education and a special needs child, sort of like the evidence. Even though as classical Lutheran educators we're not doing this for test scores or anything like that, it's just nice to have some measurable evidence that what we're doing is effective. Then we'll talk about the immeasurable things, the beautiful reasons for applying classical Lutheran education to a special needs child. And then we'll get to the how, and you have some of those tips in your handout, tips to modify what we do for the special needs child, and then a reminder that this is not a fix, this is not a cure for special needs, that this is not theology of glory, that we're going to make everyone better and better. These children will retain all of their challenges, all of the suffering that they go through in this life, but classical Lutheran education gives them transcendence beyond it in Christ. So first, some definitions and distinctions. Something that was really helpful to me is in Climbing Parnassus. It's a book that actually the author would advocate probably against what I'm advocating. So it's not really fair to take his distinction out of his book because he would not promote this. But in Climbing Parnassus, he makes a distinction between a classical era scholar and a classical education student. And we have to understand that from the beginning, because if we're thinking that we're going to have our little special needs boy turn into Dr. Kopp, that's not happening. The classical era scholar, the professor of classical studies, that person is gifted from the beginning in languages and loves letters. And that's a different thing than what we're talking about. It's not to say that we don't use the classical writings, because of course we do. We appeal to the ancients, we appeal to truth, with a capital T, truth across time. So it's going to include the truths that were revealed to Plato, Aristotle, but we're not limited to that era. That's one reason that classical education can apply to a child who has some learning troubles. Who is a special needs child? I just say that a special needs child is any child who cannot learn without significant modifications. Meaning what you do in your classroom or what you did in your homeschool with your other children doesn't work with this child. It just doesn't seem to get it the traditional way. That's a special needs child. Are there lots and lots and lots of labels that a child can have? Yes. And on the back of your front sheet, you have some warning signs for some of the major ones. That's just for your own reference. It is helpful to know the conditions, to know the particular challenges that the child faces, certainly. But what I have found with my own children, both of whom have severe special needs, we adopted them when they were 1, and they're now 16. My background was special ed, so I've always been drawn to special needs children. But they have a whole alphabet soup of diagnoses. But really, across the board, they all need high structure and intensive tutoring, regardless of whether they have been given a diagnosis, whether they need a diagnosis, whether they need medication. They're going to need lots of structure, and they're going to need some tutoring. They're going to need some outside help, whether that's from you as a homeschool mom. A lot of homeschoolers spend 90 minutes, they'll say, because it's so efficient. You can combine so many things. Spend maybe 90 minutes per child in direct instruction. Well, we've never been able to just do 90 minutes. We've always done 5 or 6 hours a day. They just have to have extra practice. They have to have extra review, extra time with their memory work. So in a sense, with the modifications, it doesn't matter what they have, but it is helpful to obtain a good diagnosis. If you have a child in your classroom, in your family, that you're concerned about, and you see some of these warning signs and you think, that sounds a lot like my child, then I would recommend a private evaluation. We never went through the public schools, even though I was in the public school system. I don't advocate going that route, because if they label your child and then they want that child in the program. Currently, 1 in 5 children are labeled having special needs. 1 in 5. There's extra funding that comes with the label, but in order to get a child out of a special needs government program, the parent has to go through due process. My husband's an attorney. He looked at the paperwork when we were first told our children needed this at 3, and he said, we're not doing that. I didn't think I could homeschool them myself. Even I have a master's in special ed, and I just was afraid I couldn't do that. What I found, though, is that one-on-one has just been fabulous for them. So whether it's tutoring through homeschool or tutoring through after school, that's what they're going to need. It's a lot of structure and a lot of tutoring, regardless of the diagnosis. The government special ed programs, some of them have great teachers, wonderful teachers. And if you have a good teacher, it almost doesn't matter the setting. But the approach that I was taught was very focused on behaviors and very focused on behaviorism. And it had a limited scope in the sense that rather than trying to develop a well-educated human being, you were looking at isolated, objective behaviors. And so you have things that ring hollow, like a teacher who has the attention of a child saying, nice ears. Just things that don't seem, I don't know, what's wrong with, I appreciate that you're listening, or just being excited about teaching anyway, and just when you have their attention, just going on with the work. I don't know, it just is a focus on isolated, almost menial, almost dehumanizing behaviors, and also emphasizes the child's weaknesses. Typically they want to ignore the strengths. If they're on grade level or above, let's ignore all of that, and let's focus on where they need remediation.
We'll stop the goal. If we've gained the goal, we stop teaching reading at that point. Happened to my child this year. She gained her goal. We're done.
Right.
Told the aide not to teach any more reading. I am dead serious. No more new words.
Even if they love reading, we cannot work on that.
She was turned on to reading at level, first level reading, and they actually told us to stop.
So it's somewhat behavioristic, somewhat dehumanizing, somewhat focused on the child's weaknesses or deficits, and there is an emphasis on passivity. Again, we are right here in this government special ed, receiving services. That's what you sign on for when you're 3, all the way up through adulthood. You are passively receiving services. You try to get as many services as you can get. And even though they're helpful, we did all of the OT, occupational therapy, PT, physical therapy, speech and language. We did all of those. We obtained those, thankfully, through their insurance, though. And this is what I recommend, is going to a private hospital. We work with Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital in St. Louis, and we have from their infancy. And that has been just a tremendous blessing to us. Crucifixes on the walls. It's a Catholic hospital. There's an emphasis on prayer, on the whole child, and that has really helped us. But the emphasis is on receiving services. Adapted classical Lutheran education, on the other hand, is humanizing in the best sense of the word humanism. It is a humanizing, elevating, transcendent, and with the Lutheran, eternal in Christ approach to the child. It's humanizing, elevating, transcendent, and eternal. And there is an emphasis on service. These children have a vocation. No matter their handicapping conditions, they have a vocation. Their lives are still to utilize their own gifts and talents for love of neighbor and service to neighbor. That means we emphasize their strengths. So in adapted classical Lutheran education, the focus is their God-given gifts. Helen Keller, blind, deaf, severely behaviorally disordered, she had a gift for languages. And when she was little, she learned Latin, she learned Greek, later she learned French and German, and she read the original works in those languages. Now, given her visual handicap, challenges, she was horrible at geometry, horrible at anything with the visual spatial, and when that was emphasized, she failed. But when it was realized that she was good at the languages, that's what was emphasized, and that's what she spent her life doing. Admittedly, without the Lutheran aspect, she had a lot of socialism influences later in her life, and we don't advocate that. But in terms of adapting classical education, which was the only education in the late 1800s, that's how she was educated, because that's what education was. She ended up learning all of those languages with painstaking finger spelling by Annie Sullivan, and later with some tutors. But it was adapted classical education, not Lutheran, but classical education. Temple Grandin, are you familiar with Dr. Temple Grandin? She's living now. She is a research scientist, PhD in science. She has autism, and she is a spokesperson for autism because she's so bright, she has insight into how her mind works, how the mind of an autistic person works, and she's been able to excel in the sciences. For her, it was a teacher seeing that she was really adept at science and steering her that way. Language for a person with autism is tough. The language of social behavior, the language of anything is almost impossible. She thought in pictures. She thought visually, spatially. For this type of autism that she had anyway. Not all children with autism, I shouldn't categorically, but for her, the languages were nearly impossible, so she focused on science. My daughter Michelle, she has a math learning disability, dyscalculia, they call it. She has a handwriting disability, dysgraphia. She has dyslexia. She has all kinds of difficulties with executive function because she has schizophrenia. It's very similar to someone with Alzheimer's, where you go to make toast and you've forgotten how it all works. You know how it's going to come out. You can't remember the steps. That's kind of what she struggled with. But she loved poetry. And she loved music. And so she learned most everything through songs, geography songs, states and capital songs. Latin, she loves the Lingua Angelica CD, listens to that in her room. She loves, and we sing that together in the morning. She just loves music. So her service, she is in a little singing group in our town. We live in St. Genevieve, which is a French colonial town. And she volunteers and has for the last 5 years to sing with this group. She sings in French. She sings in German. Now, mind you, she's just pronouncing. She doesn't understand, although some of it she's learning, but and she sings in Latin. And she does poise solos in this group, and she's now 16, and it's a multi-age group, so she is a mentor now for the little ones. Her tested IQ is 75, which puts her at the near borderline mentally handicapped range. But in the areas where she excels and she serves. My son, Michael, her twin, loves history. He reads books on historical St. Genevieve for fun. He has high-functioning autism, Asperger's, and sometimes they're called little professors, and he is like that. He loves little factoids and just absorbs history, just has always loved world history, American history, and our local history. So he serves at he volunteers at a museum in our town. It is a history museum. The director is very motherly towards him. She homeschools. She's dealt with special needs kids, and she is helping him feel like he's a colleague there. He drinks coffee in the morning, just to have a cup with his colleagues. But the good thing is that even though other 16-year-olds don't want to hear about the founding of St. Genevieve, the tourists that come do. And they'll ask questions, and he remembers because he has a strong rote memory. So that's how he serves. He also is in Boy Scouts through their special needs program. And he served as a troop guide, which is when the little ones come in. Sometimes special needs kids do better with younger kids. Both of mine are like that. So when the little boys come in, he helps them learn their knots, learn their skills, and is very patient with them, partly because he's always dealt with Michelle. And so he serves in Scouts, and he was recently elected senior patrol leader over in this whole troop. And he serves in that way too. So he does a lot of volunteer work. They also have the vocation of son and daughter, and they always will, and they will likely always live with us. And my daughter makes dessert on Thursdays, and she gets kind of obsessive about it. That's why I had to make it just Thursdays, because every day, can I make pudding today? It's instant pudding, that's what she makes. And it's been every Thursday, that's what she does. And so I had to say, no, it's not Thursday. We'll just make it on one day. Otherwise, we'd have pudding, I think, 3 times a day.
Which is why you have the whiteboard.
Yeah, exactly. Pudding on Thursday. But she folds and sorts all of our laundry for my husband and me, Michael and Michelle. She does all of that. And that's just what she does. And then Michael has more ability, so he serves more. He cuts the grass and does other things like that. But it is a life of service with an emphasis on ministry. Very briefly, history of classical education. Started, of course, in the years before Christ and went a very, very long time. Not linear, like I'm showing, ups and downs, of course. But then, what did Dr. Kopp say about the 1960s, maybe? There's a big decline. My grandma was born, this is not to scale, but my grandma was born in 1912, and when she went to school, even though she was born in rural Missouri and grew up on a hog farm, she had 4 years of Latin. Everybody just, not everybody, but a lot of people took Latin if they went to school. That was part of their education. That was in the late 1920s. In 1930, 1 million students took Latin, and we know about the decline. Whenever there was an effort, like the late 1800s, to educate a special needs child, and it really started with deaf children. They had deaf schools for the deaf. Their education was a classical education because that's what it meant to be educated. So if a child went for schooling, Helen Keller too, Helen Keller's mother or father, I've forgotten, read in some literature about the education that was going on with another deafblind girl and wanted a tutor from that school. That was when Annie Sullivan came. That was the focus from the beginning. They read heroes of history, they read Bible stories, they learned Latin, they learned English grammar, they learned world history, geography. She had a puzzle where she felt where things were. That's what she received. Okay, well, Public Law 94-142 came about in what year? Anybody know? 1975, right close. So all of a sudden, public schools were required to provide a free public education in the least restrictive environment for all special needs children. But to what education did they gain access?
How much?
And from that time, that's really been how it has been for most special needs programs.
Just an aside, in Wyoming, just 22% of our students are categorized as special needs students.
Well, and that would be about 1 in 5.
Yeah, pretty close. And I think it's grown dramatically since the state does 100% payback. So
yes,
local
exactly.
districts don't pay for special ed, so we actually categorize a lot more students than we used to because of the funding model.
In the 80s,
for every 5 special ed students, you get a new staff member.
Yeah.
That way, it's just been an exponential growth of special ed referrals since they started the funding model, which is good.
In the 80s, it was 1 in 10.
Mm-hmm.
So it increased that quickly. Okay, so the quantifiable evidence that this is not necessarily the place to go right here down in public school, servile education. My daughter asked me to share her story. That's how I became involved in CCLE in the first place. She said, I want my life to help other people. She knows she's limited by what she can do, and she really asked me to tell her story. My son doesn't really feel the same way, so I don't want to talk about him quite so much. But This is my daughter, Michelle, on paper. She has juvenile onset schizophrenia. Their biological mother had schizophrenia, and she developed it at a very early age, started seeing hallucinations scary hallucinations when she was 4, and it sort of went on from there. She is on the autism spectrum. She has severe learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, very disorganized. She'll wear one sock out the door and not think about the fact that she doesn't have the other sock or shoes on. She just doesn't think in an organized way. Again, like a person with severe dementia. She has a lot of medical conditions. She has a sleep disorder, dystonia, which is a result of the antipsychotics she has to take for her schizophrenia. Her muscles just clench up involuntarily. She has chorea. She has a tremor, and that affects her handwriting quite a bit. Severe migraine, that can wipe her out for 3 days at a time. She's on a lot of medicine for a lot of these things. She has asthma. She wears glasses for her nearsightedness and is worsening as she gets older. She has some additional psychiatric conditions, obsessive compulsive disorder, and if you know anything about that, you picked up on that with the when can I make pudding. Pica, which is eating inedible things like soaps and detergents. That's gotten a lot better over time with her medications. She's developed some anxiety and some mood instability as her schizophrenia progresses. There is some disease progression with it. There's some loss of gray matter, they think, progressively over time. On paper, that's my daughter, Michelle. We started working, like I said, with Cardinal Glennon when the kids were very young. And at that time, they were tested with all of the standardized individual tests. And she scored at an 82 in a test for receptive vocabulary, the amount of words that she takes in and understands. It correlates very highly with an intelligence test, just a shorter test, but the score on that test often reflects the score on her IQ, and it did. Her IQ was measured in the 90s at that time. So the amount of words that she understood was down in this area, which compared to all other children, it was 6%. Actually, I guess it would be this way. She did better than 6% of children, but 94% of children her age taking the same test would do better than she did. This is a poorly drawn bell curve that I did late last night. And but 100, if you're not familiar with it, 100 is average. So falling in between 90 and 110 would be most people. Permanent members of the board, Dr. Kopp, you. It would be a clear. And then when you get to 70 and below, that's when it is considered mental retardation.
Well, your standard deviations are good. You can get up to have 3 from the norm.
Thanks. So, this was when she was about 2.5 or 3. From prior to that and then onward, we taught her the liturgy. It was language, language, language. We had a classically educated nun from Cardinal Glennon, to whom I credit, humanly speaking, most of Michelle's being. She focused on rote memory, flashcards. She sent me home with boxes of good language drills, and we worked on those every day. And we also used a lot of poetry, and I was saying earlier, we listened to Robert Louis Stevenson's songs on tape, beautiful children's poem set to music. And that's how she would fall asleep. She has a hard time falling asleep at night. So, we introduced Latin and Greek at age 6 just through rummy roots. It's just vocabulary at that point. We did not go to a grammar formal program, even though a lot of people might, and that's perfectly fine. We needed to get our English phonics down, I felt, and I might be wrong about that, but that's just how I did it. I focused on vocabulary only at that time. She loved Latin and Greek from the beginning. We did other Latin programs then, started formal Latin in 5th grade. But it was just heavily language from little bitty on to 5th grade. And at that time, Kathy Hines, Dr. Hines' wife, said, "You've got to come to a CCLE conference." And I told her there's nothing there for me. I teach special needs children, and I was really getting kind of discouraged thinking, am I going the wrong path? Should we be headed toward trade school, just the menial things? Should I be spending time teaching them how to use a can opener? And I was really struggling with that. Well, she had to be retested. So in 5th grade, they retested her on the same test, the receptive vocabulary test. And guess where she scored? Any guesses?
Just specifically vocabulary?
This is receptive vocabulary. It's the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, but it does correlate highly with an intelligence test, one they use often. Any guesses?
104.
Do you think she got up to average?
I think she was probably a little below average, probably 97 or 98.
Above.
Way.
130. She scored in the gifted range for receptive vocabulary. So that was highly affirming to me. And from there, we have continued, and I've become very passionate about classical Lutheran education for the special needs child for the quantifiable reasons. The immeasurable reasons I've really sort of referred to already, but being able to sit with kids who, on paper, look like this, and my husband teaching them through rote memory, those foundational grammar things that we do are just perfectly structured for a child who needs structure. He taught them the 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer by the time that they were 3. And that seems ridiculous when you look at this. It seems ridiculous that you would sing the liturgy in the morning and pray and focus on the whole human being, but that's what we did. And had we gone a different track, this would have been the focus. I just know it would have.
So just to clarify, you actually concentrated on her strengths, because as you said before, she didn't have mathematically, that was not her strength.
Right.
Math and cognitive,
It still
advanced
isn't.
cognitive functions, but you concentrated on her vocabulary and literary aspects.
At that time, that was actually her weakness. We focused on everything back then. And I've been able to stay home, and I'm very grateful for that. So we really did across the board. It's more now that they're 16 that I think, okay, I'm not going to remediate this math difficulty. And I never did really overemphasize math for her because it was so difficult. She's 16 and she's in Saxon 7-6. And I am thrilled that she got that high. It takes us 2 or 3 years to do one level, because she can only do a half lesson a day after lesson 40, typically. First 40 are review, but then every level has been like that from 40 on to 120 or whatever. She's needed 2 days to do a lesson, and sometimes not back-to-back either. But, yeah.
7-6, so that's amazing. The GRE is only, the graduate record exam is only given at an 8th grade level of math. I mean,
Is that right?
it's an incredibly easy test, yeah. But she's there. She wanted to go to grad school for a GRE. If she can maintain that, that's incredible.
Well, there are a lot of other skills The executive function
Yeah.
skills.
Well, what I'm saying, all I test is linguistics and mathematical ability, and it's an 8th grade level
Right.
test. That's all it is for college graduates.
I said, speaking to public law, 94132, and the least restrictive environment, and social ID, they're really pushing these kids need to be in regular classrooms so they can learn from their peers. You've been homeschooling, so it sounds like she does, they both get out into a social setting and everything, but as far as in a school, can you just speak on those topics and
Well, I'm looking at the clock.
I know.
I'll take a couple of minutes. My first job out of college was to work in a public school system, and it was to promote inclusion, because that is the big push. And there is a lot of merit to that. For some of the higher functioning kids, especially the younger ones, the first graders, you didn't want them to be in a room with 6th grade BD boys, behaviorally disordered boys, which means conduct disorder, sometimes jail records by then. You didn't want that to be their educational norm or their social norm. And so we did effectively eliminate 2 of our classrooms, 2 of our special needs classrooms, by giving support instead to the teacher. So my job was to travel around the elementary schools and to help the teacher problem solve just little things like put him in the front, be sure you tap him on the shoulder rather than calling attention to him if he's messing around, just quietly so he's not always Johnny no, that sort of thing. If he drops his pencil, try to not make a big deal of it because he's going to. If he falls out of his chair, I know it's just a chair, but he's going to fall out, all those sorts of things. We would just help them to make it work.
for mild learning disabilities.
Right, and the younger grades. Now, once you had kids who had been on that track and they were in 5th grade, and this wouldn't work for my daughter either, to try at 5th grade or 6th grade to put them in the regular classroom when the study skills, the organizational skills, the reading level in every content area, the mental stamina for an entire day, that wouldn't work. And it seems now the authors of the textbook that I was taught under, they have come full circle. They produce a new textbook every year. And now they are saying maybe that self-contained classroom
Wasn't all bad.
wasn't such a bad idea.
It all depends on the students too.
Right.
If they're in a classroom where everybody else is functioning here and they're down here, they know it.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the philosophy is you put them in there and you give all the students, you help them all function as a group and work together and not make that a stigma.
Well, and I can tell you the number one thing that made it work or not work
The teacher.
Yeah.
was the teacher. No question.
My son has Down syndrome, he's in the public school. I'd love to have him in my class. Junior high, they do the function
No.
of someone sitting there with him.
Right.
And he's in his own classroom, and luckily there's only 3 other students in there, and 3 teachers. So he does get that one on
Yeah.
time. And they have him do things in the school, but the thing that bothers me a little bit is Sam has learned to do things to draw attention to himself and to kind of become the school clown in a lot of ways. And I would love to bring him home and teach him, but it would be hard with me being gone all day. I mean, him being at school all day, he comes home, he doesn't want to go to school.
Right.
And my wife does not feel like she could do that often. But I do see when we first went to classical, I thought, this is really memorization. I mean, church loves to sing, can't understand what he's saying, because he doesn't have high verbal skills.
Right.
But he is very good receptive.
And they're baptized children of Christ.
Yes,
They're
they are.
hearing the word.
And he loves church. He likes
I
going
do
to church,
too.
likes to say the Lord's Prayer.
I'm thankful that the Lutheran Church is so liturgical and
Yes,
so
yes,
structured.
If you were
The
to
repetition
the
is
church,
wonderful.
say my child.
No, that's true. That's true.
And and that we believe that they're a child of God and they don't have to say the words, I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior.
Right, right, we're not depending on reason, right, absolutely, it's all
We
God's
know
word.
it's God's word.
Yeah.
Well, now, are your children, have they gone through confirmation?
They did.
And they did, okay.
They were baptized, they went through confirmation, we adapted it.
Yeah, I got a program from Bethesda.
Oh.
And them to go through with the pastor
Wonderful.
that has cards and all kinds of
Yes.
stuff.
And see, the resource guide, that's one of the reasons that we put this together, because the child at 16 is not going, a special needs child at 16 is not going to be able to do the things they're saying at Veritas Press that a 16-year-old can do. But like Colors I See in Church, those board books, we use those for years. They teach the colors of the church, the seasons of the church, the 6 chief parts of the catechism. They're nice little books on those. They're storybooks. So it doesn't have, it's the content. You know, it doesn't have to be the level. And so much of the neoclassical is focused on rigorous academics. But it's never been just about that. That served a purpose to develop a disciplined, ordered mind. But it's always been about what's good, true, and beautiful, overarching. And if we need to give them books at a lower level, then that's okay.
I think that when I was in school, my mom was asked to tutor a young man who had special needs, and the pastor would not confirm him unless he could say all of that wrote. And it was so hard to explain to him, hey, he's got concepts. Isn't that enough? You know, he needs to be confirmed with, you know, with his peers if he's got that much down. And just trying to find resources for him to understand that.
Well, and I know
a fair pastor is gone, you know, they're not God in the pulpit anymore like they used to be.
Well, and it's a pastoral call whether some special needs children take Holy Communion or not. Now, my pastor, he felt as though that was completely appropriate for them to receive the Lord's Supper after instruction. But what he did is he provided me with all the memory work 2 summers prior to their entering in 7th grade. So our early morning Bible, I learned a long time ago to start with Bible for my own sake. With the day, starting with those academics without reminding yourself, this is God's work anyway, it's not me. But we did the Bible memory work, the catechism work, for that a long time, so that they never would have been able to memorize in a week what they needed to do. And then during the class, his method was fill in the blanks as you go, and he would lecture, and they were to take notes and fill in the blanks of the things that he said. There was no way in the world that would happen. And the very first week, he said that they were on number 12, and my son Michael had said, back on number 1, could you spell justification? So we had to adapt that real fast. So he sent it home with us, and so they could work on 4 problems and another 4, and look it up in the catechism themselves, and we would go through it. And then they could take their homework completed and just listen, and he let us do that, and that worked really well, because again, it's the content. Okay, so now they're in the adult Bible class. We don't have a Sunday school, and we are reading through the Book of Concord. Our pastor is Fort Wayne trained, and that's where they're getting their dialectic and rhetoric, because it's combined in the Book of Concord. Just perfect examples of argument persuasively and eloquently in the Book of Concord. And they can read, not always understand, but they can read the Latin phrases that are there throughout. So those are the immeasurable, the things that make me so thankful. Okay, tip to modify. You have a sheet. It's your second page front. Number 1, I have learned the hard way, do not attempt too much. Little by little. And it will happen. It will happen, but it's just very small steps. If you try to do too much, they frustrate, you frustrate, and it's just awful. And the love of learning is trampled on too. So don't attempt too much. I'm going to read you The Boy and the Filbert, Aesop's fable. A boy put his hand into a jar of filbert, it's a kind of nut, and grasped as many as his fist could possibly hold. But when he tried to pull it out again, he found he couldn't do so, for the neck of the jar was too small to allow the passage of so large a handful. Unwilling to lose his nut, but unable to withdraw his hand, he burst into tears. A bystander who saw where the trouble lay said to him, "Come, my boy, don't be so greedy. Be content with half the amount, and you'll be able to get your hand out without difficulty." The moral of the story is do not attempt too much at once.
Might have to be one.
With special needs kids, yes, it's not a half. I have to think of what I'd love to accomplish, and they cut it down into about a fourth of that, and then put that on the board, and it's so hard for me to do that. But that is the only way to go. Number 2, provide the order and the routine with daily overviews every day. And that's obviously more if you have a child at home. But if you're tutoring or in the classroom, everybody else knows what the rules are by October.
For suggestion, I have a written schedule. I have a picture schedule for my autistic or my children who have, well, I even have kindergartners in there. So they learn the pictures to go with the clocks and the times. I'm
Very
teaching
good.
time, clocks, pictures, and words.
Love it. When my kids were little, we had along the wall in the kitchen, thankfully my husband did mine, a picture calendar, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and I tried to keep it routine. They went to their therapies at Cardinal Glennon, so I went and one day took a picture of Cardinal Glennon. We took a picture of our church, not just any church, because that wouldn't necessarily work, but our Prince of Peace church at the time, put that on Sunday, and every day, too, we went through Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and we did the days of the week, that order, just from the beginning, but all the way through, all the way through. Number 3, obtain the child's attention before attempting to teach.
Sounds easy to say.
Important to do. Yes, right. Seems logical. Good in theory, hard to implement. I know.
In reference to 2 and 3, it sounds like you use Saxon math, is that correct?
We do.
Well, I mean, it's taken, I've been a proponent of it for a long time. It's taken a lot of hits this weekend,
Yes.
which I'm just thinking of absolutely ignore if it works. And, does it work in this setting for you very well? I mean, because it is reiteration, it is reinforcement continually.
Yes, and I don't know, and I'm really not trying to plug this. Obviously, any profits go to CCLE, but in the math section, there's a book on how to use Saxon math, and that was really helpful for me. And I actually was able to talk to the author of that book, and he said he had kids who had special needs, and he did exactly what I'm doing because I'm doing what he told me to do, which is to do half lessons every day.
15 instead of 30 probably.
But make sure it's all the odds and then all the evens. That's a lot harder to do because you have to keep track. It's a lot harder for my son to keep track of that, but ideally you would do all the odds, all the evens, because they have that spiral review built in, and you want every concept hit, and sometimes 19 and 20 will be double the division or something, so you don't necessarily want to do 1 through 15 and 15
Right.
through 30. But yes, it is very helpful for special needs kids. I think Dr. V's complaint is it's not unified, it's not large, And so what we've done to try to help with that is we've read biographies on mathematicians, tried to tie it in with history. He's right, of course. He's Dr. B. We could benefit from a more classical approach to math. There are also some resources in here for teachers of math to understand the bigger picture of order and beauty, the things in mathematics that really aren't found in text.
Concordia's curriculum guides are very helpful for that.
Okay. Okay, teach on the child's level in each area. I don't know that these are necessarily classical, but they have been helpful for me. These 3 levels. Independent, and actually, I'm sorry, I wrote those incorrectly. Number 1 would be independent, number 2 would be instructional, and number 3 would be frustration. Meaning, if a child reads at, say, a 3rd grade level, and you have a book on ancient Greece, a historical fiction book that's at a 1st or 2nd grade level, he can read that on his own and glean from it what he needs to glean. The instructional level would be for him at about a 3rd or 4th, meaning you would help him with vocabulary words prior to his reading. You would ask questions about comprehension. You would instruct from where he is and a smidge higher. The frustration would be if you say, well, he's a 5th grade student, he's a 3rd grade student, so he's a 5th grade student, so he should be reading at a 5th grade level, and then you gave him a 5th grade level book, but he really reads at a 3rd grade level. That isn't going to work. He's going to be frustrated by it, no matter how much instruction you give him. So finding that window, not only in every academic area, which is a lot easier with the one-on-one, a lot easier with tutoring, I know, and a lot easier with homeschooling than it is in a classroom. That's the key. But it's not just for academics, it's also for behavioral expectations. Are we expecting our 7th grader with special needs to be able to function in an organizational manner like a 7th grader? Well, that's not going to happen. You're going to have frustration on the part of yourself and the child. In fact, for organization, my daughter has such severe problems that either my husband or I go into her room once a week, and we spend at least an hour. If we've missed a week, then it's a lot more than that. And we help her sort through all the books, the papers, the socks, all over her floor, and we help her put them back. And we actually have a lock on her closet. I only get out 1 outfit a day. I don't really know how it happens, but she brings things in. She brings papers in because she writes. She writes poetry by the reams. I have boxes of her poetry, and so a lot of it is papers, and then those edges. She doesn't like the spiral notebook itself, and I guess it was the only paper we had in the house or something, I don't know, but tore it out and then wrote from that. Oh my goodness. Anyway, but if I said go clean your room, that's just silly. That's at the frustration level. A really, really helpful book, which is also in that guide, All Through the Ages. Christine Miller has compiled a book that goes by historical periods. So you have, say, ancient Greece, and she's taken all of the good biographies from ancient Greece and categorized them by reading level. So you can have biographies at a 1st to 3rd grade reading level. They're 1st to 3rd, 4th through 6th, 7th through 9th, and 10th through 12th. We will likely, with Michelle, never study anything at that 10th through 12th level, ever. But I can bring home books at that 4th through 6th, and she devours them. There were some Heroes of the Faith books from CCLE. I so wanted to get the one on Rosa Young for her. She would just read that for fun. She's read Kitty My Rib about Martin Luther's wife. She's read that dozens of times. And she'll do that independently if I have the right reading level. All through the ages. They also have math and sciences and the arts in there too. But if you're able to adapt in whatever setting you're in, then I really recommend that resource. It's called All Through the Ages. I think the subtitle is History Through Literature, something like that. The focus is definitely on history, but she has American history, breaks it down by time period, exploration, colonization, and not just biographies, either historical fiction. She has a whole section. She's a person that likes to make lists. She has overviews of timelines in there by grade level. It's just a really, really good comprehensive source. Kathy and I told me about that years ago, and I'm so glad I got it.
What was the author name again? What was her name?
Christine Miller. Another helpful thing, she has a literature guide, and we do too on CCLE. Her literature guide is, she has a whole bunch of good books that lead to the great books. For our children that will never read Nietzsche and Plato and Aristotle, except in quotes, I can take chunks, and they'll get a chunk of it, but she's not going to read through Plato's Republic, the entire thing. But there are good books written for children, of course, and so she has a good list on her website. I think it's called 1,000 Good Books to Get to 100 Great Books or something like that. Then number 4, this is critical, ensure their optimal overall health. And again, I know as teachers you don't have too much control over it, although when I was in the public school system I always placed my special needs kids with this one teacher because she had a classroom with rows and a door, and it was a structured classroom focused on learning. And she had a nutrition experiment that she did every year. She had 2 cages of mice. One, she would feed soda, cookies, whatever. McDonald's, French fries, the high salt, high fat, high sugar. And the other, she would feed whatever they were supposed to eat. And they just stayed in the classroom. I don't know if she had them record or do anything more than that or just observe, but of course, every year, these guys got fat and sluggish and their coats looked horrible, and the ones with the good nutrition looked quite good. And it was a really effective way.
Well, let the kids, you can feed your kids that. They don't stop you from that.
That's true. That may be prohibited. I don't know. The other thing in terms of health is, and this may not apply in your settings, but I have found for myself that I am the keeper of the medical record. We're so splintered, the neurologist, the cardiologist, the asthma and immunologist, and no one has all of the records except me. And so I have a notebook with all of their medications and dosages, and I have to keep that updated. And no one has that unless the advocate for that child has that. That is so important. And I'll have one doctor prescribe a medication, and I'll go look, and one of the effects will be a low white blood count. And one of the things I didn't put up here is she has neutropenia, which is a low white blood count. Well, if the one doctor doesn't know that, she can, yes. So, or a low seizure threshold. The one doctor wouldn't know that, the neurologist knows that, but so that's so critical to their overall health, to keeping them out of the hospital. And then teaching the child, and this is why I love the emphasis on thinking, teaching the child his own illness education, what his weaknesses are. And that requires humility, which gets back to this. It's not this. It's the Lutheran concept that we are all just weak creatures. We all have our own weaknesses, and they need to know what those are, and that they need help, and that they will always need help. And it's a humbling thing, but instead of teaching self-esteem, no matter what, kind of for no reason, it's helping them see themselves for who they are on this earth. They are weak people, and they need to understand with insight what their own weaknesses are. Cultivate a taste for the Holy Scriptures, hymns, good literature. Number 6, I won't go over those too much. You'll have to be, because we're almost out of time. Develop a respectful, compassionate teacher-student relationship. Just as God in Christ has forgiven us, so we are to forgive our children, be tender-hearted with them. And there's a quote there, such attachments are of great assistance to study, for pupils are glad to listen to those whom they love. That should be number 1.
If you can't learn from somebody, you don't.
You're right, it really is. It really is. Right. And then last, using leisure for good. These kids do not need computer screens, video games. They do not need to be wasting their time. They don't have that much time when they're functioning at a high level. They need to be using it for their own good and the good of others. And when you do that, that's why that's partly why this explodes, because of what other children who are going to be tested are doing in their free time. We're not doing. And then last, because we're almost out of time, as I said, this is not theology of glory. The classical and Lutheran education will not fix these children, but they do help them through their suffering, because they do suffer, and so do their parents, and their grandparents, and their teachers. Michelle wrote a poem on the back of your whole handout. She just wrote this the other day. I'll read it to you. She called it Problems. Storm clouds gather in the sky. Waves buffet the ship at sea. A child sick in bed tosses and turns, wondering when it will end. But God has plans for these things. Just wait and see what happens. Just wait and see. Thank you.